share my story first and prepare you so that you'll be ready for the gift when I give it to you. My grandfather, Thomas, in Acton, North Hampshire, England, was a blacksmith. One of his sons was named Thomas. My father was a silk dyer when he lived in England. When he came to America, there was no demand for silk dyeing. There were not enough fancy people who wore silk. So he converted himself into a candle maker. One of my earliest work experiences was working in the candle shop, boiling tallow and trimming wicks and cleaning up afterwards. Not a pleasant thing. And I was apprenticed out after that to my brother John to become a printer, which I spent the better part of 30 years being a printer. Now, I want to tell you 3 or 4 different stories before I give you this gift. I was apprenticed out to my brother when I was 12, and I stayed with him as an apprentice until I was 17. I was supposed to have stayed until I was 21, but like all good brothers, John and I did not get along. He took great exception to some of my shenanigans, and I took exception to some of his overlord tactics. So at 17 years old, after a literal knockdown, drag-out fight, I decided I was breaking my indentured contract and I was going to run off to find my fortune. I went to New York City and tried to get a job as a printer's apprentice there, to no avail. I went from there to Philadelphia. When I got to Philadelphia, I had a pocket full of coins between me and starvation. And what I did with those coins is I bought 3 rolls. I ate one, a good idea. I gave 2 away to 2 ladies that drove over with me on the ship. So I was down to literally not more than a day or 2's worth of survival. Well, 25 years later, I was one of the richest men in the colonies. The average tradesman in colonial America made 60 pounds a year. My various business dealings and other apprentices that I set up in the printing business, I earned 2,000 pounds a year. So if you do the math on that, I was well off. And I'm often asked, how did I ever accomplish that? Quite a feat for a blacksmith's grandson, for the son of a silk dyer / candle maker. And so many times was I asked that question, in the last edition of Poor Richard's Almanac, I gave the answer. I gave it in the form of a sermon delivered by Father Abraham. And in that sermon, I recounted every bit of wisdom about wealth that I had accumulated over the course of my life, and Father Abraham delivered that in Poor Richard's Almanac. And probably 3 words give you the short version: hard work, frugality, and knowledge. Those were the 3 cornerstones with which I managed to turn a pocket full of coins into 2,000 pounds a year and be one of the richest men in the colonies. Well, I was so wealthy that after 27 odd years of being a printer, I wanted to move on. I had developed a great interest in electricity. And electricity at that time was a bunch of people would go from town to town, and if I had a ball with static electricity on it and I touched it right out, can you imagine what would happen to my hair? And that was the kind of thing they did. But I somehow thought there was more to that phenomenon that we ought to be exploring. So I decided to spend some of my fortune thinking and talking and working and reading and studying about electricity. And lo and behold, came up with what seemed to be common sense to me, but obviously was not to the rest of the world, that when you're out in a thunderstorm and you hear that big crack and see that sky light up, that bore a striking resemblance to what the parlor people were doing with their little static electricity. So I wrote a paper and I sent it to a friend of mine in England saying, I think electricity and lightning are one of the same phenomena. And he sent it to some friends in Paris, with the technique for studying whether that was in fact true. Now, I had not actually done it yet, but some enterprising Frenchman decided, wow, this makes sense, he'll try it, and lo and behold, proved that it was in fact true. Well, that swept me not only from fortune, but fame. And throughout France and England and all of Europe, I became famous by the common sense thought that lightning and the static electricity are one and the same. Hey, I didn't argue. And I finally, before I even got word back that they had proven it to be true, I set up an experiment with a kite in a thunderstorm in order to prove that it was true. I do not recommend you try this at home. So that moved me into scientific community in Europe. They were overtaken with it, and in 1753 gave me the Godfrey Copley Award for Science, which is kind of the Scientist of the Year. That made me even more famous, and so famous was I by that point that all of the colonies were hiring me to be their spokesman in Europe because I had such contacts and notoriety and connections with the Parliament and the King, and so then I became an agent. So my little career was moving along from printer, author, inventor. Also got involved in organizing military campaigns and civic activities and everything else. And had it been not for the increased ferment that was going on in the colonies, I would have been more than happy to stay with my little electrical experiments. But you see, I figured that if the sky could light up like that, why couldn't you light up other spaces? I ran a wire down through my house, and every time lightning struck my lightning rod, it would illuminate the room that the wire went down through. Now, my wife did not take kindly to it. It scared her quite a little bit. So I had to kind of end that end of my experiment. But what really interrupted my foray into electricity was the revolution. And one of the greatest compliments ever paid to me was paid to me by King George III of England. He said I was the evil genius behind the revolution. Wow. Little did he know my role was relatively minor. It showed how clueless he was that he was the one behind the revolution. His lack of ability to understand what was going on in the colonies and taxing them to death, that was the cause of the revolution. Well, as you know, the revolution went well. 8 years. It was supposed to last 3 to 5 months, according to the British Army that invaded America. 8 years later, they had it handed to them at Yorktown. Now the real work began. How are we going to govern ourselves was the burning question. And in 1787, we met in Philadelphia, my hometown, and spent 3 or 4 months in the sweltering heat addressing that question, creating the Constitution of the United States. And rather successfully, too, I might add. And that was probably a high point in my life to be able to participate in that. And so I happen to have the good fortune to be the only man who signed the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Treaty of Paris that ended the war, and the alliance with Paris that brought France into the war. Not bad for the grandson of a blacksmith. So now is the question, and now is the gift I brought you. How is a man of such humble beginnings able to accomplish that? Get ready. One word, I'm going to boil it down to one word for you. Books. I loved books. I read them, I wrote them, I printed them, I distributed them. I started a lending library to share my love of books with other people. Everything that I did in life was based on knowledge that I had acquired through reading. I had 2 years of formal schooling from 8 years old to 10 years old at the Latin School in Boston. And in the process of that, I fell in love with words and books. And my sister, Jane, was 8 years older than I was. And she recounted her first memory of me reading. I was reading the Bible at 3 years old. She tells that story. So if you're going to read only one book, take my advice. I started at 3 years old. It was still a very incredibly valuable book. But if you want to rise beyond whatever humble beginnings you have, read some more, and read again. I spent 2 hours a day from 8 years old until 84. 2 hours every day reading and studying. Now, in my time, books were not readily available. You had to beg, borrow, and steal books. I would borrow books from prominent people while I was an apprentice, and books were valuable, so I had to develop a reputation that I would take care of their books and get them back to them. I would stay up all night reading a single book and have it back to the owner at dawn. And that really led me to create the lending library, the first lending library in the colonies, and grew into other colonies doing it. And we were really, I think, instrumental too in creating compulsory public education and emphasizing parents were the primary source of educating their children. Mothers particularly taught their children how to read and write. Even if they had limited formal schooling like I did, still it's all about that magic word. So if you want a magic carpet that will take you anywhere you want to go, it's books. Anybody know how to spell that word? Okay, go. B-O-O-K-S. That's what I want to leave you with. That is the pearl of wisdom that I brought here tonight for you. It's the magic carpet that will take you anywhere. You cannot read enough. Thank you.